Okay, hello everyone. Good to see you again. Today's lecture is going to address visual print media. Specifically, I'd like to begin with a definition of some of the media studies and how we understand media to be created in a given context and also influence the context in which it is created. I'd like to begin with that idea, and then we'll switch gears and do an analysis of posing some questions to be able to have an interactive lecture, taking a look at the dictatorship years and commercial advertisements that tell us something about about the cultural context of Spain in the early dictatorship years. In fact, we're actually going to be moving through not just the early dictatorship years, but from the 1950s in particular through the 70s. Note, this is not the 1940s, which are really truly the post-war years. In other words, the dictatorship, of course, is installed in 1939. But the 1940s were a time of significant hunger, as we know from the reading, also referred to as the years of hunger, los años de hambre. And they were the regime had a policy of autarky, an attempt to control all national production, which ultimately had very dire consequences. It was used as a tool of repression against Spanish society, conditioning them to not resist the new social order of dictatorship, in food rationing and so on. In other words, the culture of consumerism that, as we know it today, or even as it developed in the 1950s onward, was simply not possible. It simply was not on the it was not part of everyday life, so to speak, and it was completely unattainable for many Spaniards in the 1940s. Consider, too, that World War II begins in 1939 when Nazi Germany invades Poland, and this ultimately instigates, so to speak, of course World War II, which wouldn't end until 1945. So World War II is also going on, and this very clearly affects Spain too. Even though Spain technically was neutral in World War II, of course we know it was an ally with Mussolini and also with Hitler. No? Anyway, getting back to our definition then, I would like to begin by showing you a PowerPoint presentation. Let me share my screen with you. And here we go. Here's my first moment that I'd like to, my first definition I'd like to address is that we understand media representations as participating in shaping a given social imaginary. Okay, in other words, we understand that media helps us shape, or they in part shape the way that we think about the world and what we think of the world. I'm going to give an example in just a moment. But on the other hand of the same coin, the other side of the same coin, we see that media representations also cannot only participate in shaping a given social imaginary, they also can have that imaginary contribute to shaping media images. So there is a reciprocal effect here. In fact, the best way I could probably describe it is with this image by M.C. Escher, where we see drawing hands, right? And there's a reciprocal relationship here that a given representation can influence a reality, but also that can also inversely influence a given representation. So this is a sort of a circular or a reciprocal relationship, okay? Let me give you an example. This concept to us might seem abstract, but then once we begin to give examples, it's quite intuitive. Today's world, let's start there. The number of Instagram profiles that people post, photos of themselves, selfies, are imitating certain poses, gestures, are imitating certain manners of dress, sometimes even makeup styles, that become sort of mainstream or define a given set of ideal archetype beauty for a given gender, right? And then we see that those representations, those photos online, because they are media, they are representations after all, can influence inversely other people to conceive the imaginary, to be able to conceive of what is desirable as an archetype beauty. So we see then there is a reciprocal process, right? Particularly with social media, that's more evident to us with social media because we participate in creating media, and social media also shapes our own reality and our own perceptions of reality. So that seems intuitive, but at a time before social media, let's say, this is why I have Valentino here, in the time of the first audiovisual media, the first moving pictures, and even before sound pictures, silent screen actor Rudolph Valentino was instrumental, sort of the heartthrob of the 20s on screen, was instrumental in, or film generally as a medium, was instrumental in shaping archetype beauty to audiences. And audiences reciprocally would get an imaginary or would participate in perceiving collectively that these heartthrobs on screen, regardless of gender, would become sort of icons, idols, or to be imitated. And so they would help establish given patterns of archetype beauty, of femininity or masculinity in audiences, right? This then is also seen in, say, cosmetics and certain supplies or things that are for aesthetics and beauty supplies that are sold to the general population, right? In other words, we see that there is some kind of reciprocal relationship between the material reality that is begotten from a social imaginary and the media representations that circulate within it. Okay, so that's why the media studies definition that I wanted to get at. That's kind of the encapsulating thrust of what we're getting at here. Okay, so let's take a look then. What I'd like to do is show you. Here we are. Media images or advertising, commercial advertisements very specifically in the 1950s in dictatorship through the 70s, right? The dictator passed away in 1975, and so we're going to be moving through the early 70s. Okay, so I'd like to propose a few questions. When we are analyzing material, consider the following. Okay. In fact, this could help you potentially structure your first critical analysis paper if you choose. When you choose some kind of media, choose some kind of image, and just one. All you need is one. And truly work that image, really work with it. In other words, describe what you see, its cultural context, what cultural codes you need to be able to access that media image. And also the meaning that surrounds it. All of this is important to demonstrate in a given, in your chosen media object, right, or representation. So one of the things I'd like to ask you is what properties of the images that I'm about to show you, or particularly of what it's representing, the product, it's a commercial product, a very specific kind of propaganda or media image. What properties of the product are highlighted in the text in the image, and how are they done so? That's an important piece. It'll tell us something about the social circumstance. Also, what's the product's target audience? Let's think about who is it directed at in terms of gender, maybe age, maybe social class, maybe nationality, maybe religion, maybe race and ethnicity. Now, we can't always presume that all of these factors are at play. But oftentimes, at least gender is. But not necessarily are all of them going to be at play always. So let's take a look at that too. Next is the product branded with an identity? Does it have its own identity in a way? And if so, how? In other words, sometimes products are chosen to be to have a given identity or even a logo itself or a reputation that precedes itself. And how is that represented? What's its association? Also, what underlying cultural messages or contexts are used to sell the product? This is what we need to get at. This is how we crack our cultural codes, basically. And then finally, interestingly, what desires or emotions do the advertisements aim to foster or presume in customers? And sometimes this can help us access more information or presumptions that surround the given cultural context of an advertisement. Okay, so let's think about these as a framework when we take a look at the material. Okay, our first bit here. Let's see if I can move my bar out of the way. Yes, good. Okay, so our first is, I mentioned before, this comes from a print advertisement. It's an online archive. It's accessible to you by ABC newspaper. It's the Hemeroteca, which is what we refer to as like the press archive of ABC newspaper from the 1950s. And we see an advertisement here that translates as, "You'll be admired or astounded for such surprising results from Niavina cream, the cream that rejuvenates and beautifies, nourishing your skin. It's not a luxury item, it's a hand cream, Niavina." These jingles are actually entertaining to read too. So go ahead and pause the video, take a moment, ask yourself those set of questions. Describe what it is that you see in order to draw that from the image or from the text as evidence to make your argument. Let's practice this, in other words, as though it's a critical reflection piece. Well, go ahead and pause the video now. Okay, once you're done, let's take a look. Now, the reading that I'm going to model isn't the only one viable, but what I try to do is model for you an example of how you could approach the given material. Of course, what makes a material right or wrong, what makes a response right or wrong, isn't necessarily, it's ultimately how you build your argument, what evidence we can make and what presumptions we can make without overstepping our bounds about the evidence in text and image. So it's really important to always describe what it is you see as evidence for your justification, your observations, okay? So without further ado, let's see. First, I'd like to note that what we see here is a 1950s, very much dressed in a hoop skirt, thin-waisted. So we see a woman who's wearing white gloves. It is an advertisement for a hand cream. She's looking up. There's a positive-looking gaze, and she's looking up to even to the sky, it seems, with a smile on her face. In other words, it is an image of ideal happiness. And we see that she's dressed in a manner that would be of a middle-class housewife from the 1950s, specifically this modern dress of accentuates the thin waist and the hoop skirt. We see then the text itself, "You'll be admired or you'll be astounded." There's a dual play on words here in the original Spanish. Admirada se quedará, which means you'll be admired as though consuming this product will gain social acceptance around your admiration, but also you'll be astounded. You yourself will be impressed by the quality of the project, by such surprising results from this cream. It's a cream that rejuvenates and beautifies, nourishing your skin. It's not a luxury item, it's a hand cream. What's interesting about this is that it's sold to a specific audience that might presume that certain cosmetics are out of range for their budget. In other words, it's sold to potentially, say, working class families, or families that aren't necessarily of a middle class that we see here, or ones that of a middle class, of course, are concerned about keeping pocketbooks and watching spending and savings. And so we see, in other words, that there is a question of the cost of the item being accessible to the population it's being sold to. And then there's also a very gendered presumption that underlines or underpins this too, right? Why would middle-class women or working-class women be presumed to need a hand cream? It's not simply a question of aesthetics. For this generation, we also know that, as they are today sometimes too, but certain detergents, cleaning products, and otherwise are abrasive on the skin and the hands. And so we see, in other words, that this is a cure, so to speak, to dry hands for housewives who are presumably coming into contact with agents and that are abrasive to the skin. Okay? In other words, we see that the domestic sphere, as we've read about in today's reading, is ultimately very gendered, as the private space, the home space, and its upkeep is that of women. That's the gendered character of this this advertisement. Okay, let's go to the next one. We have an ad from 1956. Go ahead and pause and describe. Okay, now coming back, we see that there is a woman here who is leaning on a sofa. She is dressed as a modern woman. She is, in other words, in slacks or pants, loose fitting or more mobile garments, and she has a short haircut. This is the look of a modern woman from the 1950s. She's shown comfortably in her home, leaning against we know it's her home because she's leaning against a sofa. And it says, if you dream of a washer, choose the Brew Super Washing Machine, softer and more efficient than your own hands. Risa, the best price in the most lavish store. Yes, that's what washing machines used to look like, by the way. That circular drum there that would tumble. And so we see very clearly, this is perhaps a little bit more obvious, that if you dream of a washer, because we know you do, choose the Brew Super Washing Machine. In other words, the presumption of making domestic tasks easier and specifically addressed to women. In fact, too, the question that she is dressed in a modern way also gives us the sense that there's an appeal to a modern woman that's not necessarily of a traditionalist bent, so to speak. We see, in other words, that this is pitched as a time saver because it's softer and more efficient than washing with your hands. Of course, yes, there was practice before this time, was that washing was a tremendous task. That would be done usually collectively in a given one day a week. And women would get together and do it collectively because it required assistance to be able to soak and wring, but also wash and then later hang out to dry, as well as heat up irons, iron, starch, and so on. In other words, it was a significant task. And that would include, of course, washing all the clothes, but bed linens and towels, etc., for families that were sometimes upwards of 8 people. As we can imagine, it would have been a tremendous task. So it's interesting to note, too, that in the mid-20th century, if you ask in Spain, as elsewhere in the world, if you ask women of a certain generation and men of a certain generation, what's the most revolutionary technology of their time, you will get different answers. You will get different answers in the sense that the answers that are gendered, the answers that you get will certainly be gendered. Some might say television, but then we also see that there are others that are in the case of women who would potentially respond that the washer or washer dryer, etc., it also is one of the major task-saving and most revolutionary elements from another day. Okay, this next one, here we see up top an advertisement for the old kitchen. And then down below, it says modern kitchens and offices used Formica. Formica is a kind of linoleum tiling for the floor, Formica. You might be familiar with it in the United States context. It was used, in other words, to be able to sanitize areas, but it was plastic. It was a plastified sort of like a ceiling for floors and sometimes for walls without using ceramics, say, or a different kind of material. Easy to clean. Please note that up top, the old kitchen is drawn in a specific way. We see the stove heated. That's like a coal stove or a wood stove. And we see an old style kitchen that still existed in some places into the early 20th century. and then down below a photograph of a more modern kitchen. Isn't it interesting that the use of the word office is one that is taken from English? A sign of modernity after World War II is the English-speaking world, whether it's the UK or the United States, the victors from the Second World War, ultimately. That would certainly be the case here, too, in Spain, when United States political influence would certainly wield very specific power to be able to uphold the regime during the 1950s, particularly after the 1953 Pact of Madrid, and later the visit by President Eisenhower, military general himself, who met with Franco and struck a specific deal to support the regime in exchange for US military bases. And actually, those military bases still exist in Spain today, in Cádiz, in Rota, as well as also Air Force Base outside of Madrid, and so on. In other words, we see that the Spanish awareness for the United States, not only its cultural exports such as Hollywood, but also the politics of the United States influence as being the emerging world leader after World War II and the outcome of World War II, is precisely what we see as the borrowing of certain words here from English in the English-speaking world, adapted into the original Spanish as a sign of that modernity. Okay. This one will also see referenced in the reading for television ads in our next class. And so I wanted to flag that. Here we have an advertisement for different kinds of alcohol, particularly spirits. These are cognacs. It says, González Bias raises its glass and cheers cordially with all men of goodwill, wishing them a 1960 of peace, health, work, prosperity, and happiness. Tío Pepe, Andalusian sun in a bottle. It's a brand of alcohol. Soberano, which means like sovereign, okay? The king of cognacs. Go ahead and take a moment and analyze here. Okay, now in the image, we very clearly see that it is the holidays. In fact, we look and we see it's in December when this was put together. There is a Christmas ornament or holiday ornament hanging here. The advertisement itself is written in the silhouette of an advertisement, of a Christmas tree ornament. And we see that there are three men who are dressed in tuxedos of a high class. In other words, it's selling luxury in association with luxury. Who are all cheering together to peace, health, work, prosperity, and happiness, right? This notion of men's club, and particularly elite men's club, is certainly at play here. It dates to a very traditionalist gender role that's from the century prior, actually, in which men were of the public and presumed to be engaged in politics and political discussion, whereas women were more relegated to the domestic sphere, to the private life. In the 1800s, a century prior, the entire homes of the wealthy were equipped with smoking rooms and brandy rooms where the men would retire and smoke and drink and talk politics. And then women would retire to other rooms in the house to read or to work on, have their own social environment too, that also included sewing and stitching and so on. In other words, very gendered segregation in a binary way between men and women. And we see this kind of men's club or elitism here, and one that is exclusive of women. And what bonds them together is a very gendered choice of drink. In other words, the notion that cognac or Tío Pepe, etc., that these alcohols would be strong and something that would be equipped for or more fitting for a man's drink, so to speak. In other words, the actual consumption of the alcohol itself too is gendered. This happens today. Can you think of an example? Okay, moving on. Nescafe, instant coffee. Happy holidays, and afterwards, Nescafe. Go ahead. Okay, so we see here a party scene. Again, it's the holidays where people are gathering. People are all drinking coffee, coffee after a meal, we can presume, or some kind of social engagement. We see a woman who is dressed in with very fine jewelry. At least the suggestion is maybe some pearls, right? Collar, sorry, is the Spanish word, so a necklace. And she's also wearing earrings and so on in this elegant dress that tells us something about her social status. She is probably upper middle class. She's serving a man sitting with a bow tie and a jacket. It's a very formal event. And the people behind them are also well dressed in suits. And it says happy holidays, and afterwards Nescafe. Nescafe is an instant coffee. In other words, it's something that can be made quickly. It's something that can save time. And in fact, we see very clearly, probably what we notice first about this image is that that time saving is intended for women, destined for women. We see here, in other words, that she is ultimately serving, standing, running around, the man who is sitting, who is being served, right? Chanel. Go ahead and take a moment. Okay, Chanel is a luxury product. In other words, we see here something that is not attainable to the general population. Certainly not working class, potentially not middle class population. It's a luxury product, and it's a sign of luxury in the way that it is branded. We see a new Chanel product, lotion number 5, ultimately perfume number 5, which is considered to be a classic from the mid-20th century. And it says a famous name the world over. In other words, what's being sold here is the icon of Chanel itself as its own product. In other words, it has branded itself, and even the generic notion of, say, number 5. But nevertheless, the reputation of the luxury brand Chanel is precisely what is being marketed here. It's telling us as audience that if it's a famous name, and therefore something we're going to be discussing in the future. There's a future reading about this. It's what we would refer to, or Sturkin and Cartwright refer to, as a commodity fetish. In other words, that its success in branding itself and selling itself is the fact that it is recognized as a luxury product, a name that's famous the world over, Chanel. What I'm getting at here too is not only branding, but the notion of upwardly mobile branding. In other words, that a luxury product is intended to make itself desirable to audiences who probably might not be able to, or probably are not able to pay for the cost of the product. That's upwardly mobile consumerist desire. In other words, creating a desire to want to obtain a luxury good that is just out of reach of the acquisition possibilities for a given social class. Okay. Go ahead and take a moment. We see here there's a dialogue. I'm going to set this up for you. There's a dialogue that moves from top to bottom. Here it says, "Are you ready? Just a second," right? There's a man who is asking her if she's ready. And then at the advertisement, there's a third voice. It says, "For candy, 1 second is enough. Push the button and let it run alone. Thanks, Candy. The more they need you, the more you need a Candy. Candy, super automatic washer." All right, go ahead and take a moment. Okay, what's interesting about this print ad in 1965 is that the proliferation of television, we're going to talk about that in our next class, television is ultimately influencing print ads. You see that this is not just a scene or a photograph, it's a dialogue, it's actually a script. We have three speakers. We have a man, are you ready? We have a woman, just a second. And then we have a narrator who is narrating the scene, like a voiceover. In other words, the pattern of print ad is imitating a different kind of media. That's interesting to think about too. How there are questions of intermediality. In other words, how television can influence or was influenced by radio commercials, or how print ads are influenced by television. You might be able to think of some examples of that kind of intermediality in, say, internet or social media. Okay, here the product that is being sold is ultimately represented as a time saver, again, for the woman who is presumably the wife. And it's going to not only be a time saver, it's a time saver so that she can serve or service the husband. He's asking her if she's ready, and she replies, just a second, with just a finger to be able to press a button and have the automatic washer begin its work, while she herself has a tray holding a kind of drink or cocktail to be taken to the man who is requesting her service ultimately. In fact, it reinforces this notion with the jingle, the more they need you, the more you need a candy. You know, the more they call upon your time, the more you need to time save and have a candy. But that time-saving gesture is also then at the service of the house, and particularly the male authority of the house, as we've read in the reading for today. Okay. Kodak Instamatic, now in film cameras. Open, load, and film. Kodak announces a totally revolutionary system in the field of amateur cinematography, 1965. Family photography, amateur photography, instant or advances in technology of cameras that would allow for families to produce their own media, to produce their own, say, photography or even video, as we're seeing here, is precisely aimed or marketed to middle-class families who can acquire this product to be able to document their own moments together. Document their own happy moments together, clearly. What we see, of course, here is this notion of the mother of house that is taking video of this scene between the scene that there's a kiss between the father and daughter, the notion of the family bond and the nuclear family reinforced through, and this notion of happiness, middle-class happiness, that's reinforced through not only the marketing image of Kodak, but also with a set of sort of social instructions of what kind of documentation is desirable. What kind of documentation, if families are to make their own media, is desirable. In this case, of course, the notion of an ideal happiness, only happiness, of course, within in middle-class families. Mm-hmm. 1968. If you had to do business here tomorrow, you'd wear a Rolex. When a summit is held at the Palace of Nations in Geneva, the world's best watch is present. Carved from solid gold, you can recognize its classic design from the other end of the conference table. Rolex. The men who steer the world's destiny wear Rolex. Go ahead and take a couple of minutes. Okay. Here, of course, this notion of steering destiny and the world's destiny, in other words, world leaders and decision makers, elected officials, are presumably all male. The audience here is also one that is selling a luxury product as a status symbol, the Rolex, as a legible sign of success or sign of luxury and somehow success, that those two ideas are linked together. Why? Well, not only because it's a luxury product, but it says that not only is it worn, you can also recognize it from the other end of the conference table. In other words, that you yourself will be recognized by wearing this product. This notion of a men's club exclusive of women, or that excludes women, within political affairs and so on, dates to that, of course, traditionalist role that we were speaking about. It's really interesting to note that 1968 is ultimately a year of significant revolution. In 1968, there's in May of 1968, an explosion of workers' strikes, second wave feminist movements. The gay liberation movement was already underway, even though it would technically be set off by Stonewall in 1969. There were still resistances. The civil rights struggle in the United States, Black civil rights. In other words, we see that, as well as the Chicano movement, Chicano indigenous peoples movements as well in the United States context, we see, in other words, that the political scenario of 1968 is one that begins to shatter or erode the conception, of course, of traditionalist or establishment politics, and particularly as one that is predominantly male or male-oriented and also exclusively male, and elitist in its rule. That's some of the social movements we're going to be talking about in the future. But we see, in other words, that right in the same year, a commercial advertisement sort of gets at the notion that this seat of power, the Palace of Nations in Geneva, United Nations, that the world's leaders are somehow an elite male club, ultimately. I put this one in just because I think it's funny. Those shirts that are giving so much to talk about care for detail. I don't know what's going on here. I think it's pretty funny. But in 1973, we should bring back the double belt. So if this is a picnic, and here it's seemingly that there's a question of a couple of a romantic interest, and then there's this guy in the background with his mustache and double belt smoking, in modeling his shirt, and it seemingly is that he is potentially envious of this other man in his approach to the girl. Again, this notion of like a male competition over a love interest that is a woman, this kind of heterosexual triangle, so to speak, of competition among men over a woman, that we can see in the way in which this advertisement is displaying its clothes for sale. Again, but I just think it's funny because of the double belt. Okay, this last one I'll leave up to you. Love isn't a fashion. Give a gift that's never outdated, the gift that's never forgotten, the memory that never fades, the fashion that's never outdated, the value that earns more value. SR, the choice of jewelers, watchmakers, and silversmiths. A gift of gold jewelry is a luxury you can't afford not to give. We see a hand, a man's hand. It is a masculine hand in the sense that it's hairy, with a ring. It gives us the sense that it's a gendered hand, and it's on an unrecognizable part of the flesh against a naked body or a nude body somehow. We're not sure exactly what part. It's disorienting to see exactly what part of a body it is. And this is a way in which nudity, and particularly female nudity, is used as an attention grab, but also as a kind of eroticism, objectifying and fetishizing eroticism to be able to sell us the ring, the jeweler. There are many interpretations that can unfold specifically from the hand against the flesh and against an undefinable part of the human body, particularly when it is such gendered as a hand, a man's hand, against what is presumably a woman's body, particularly because this is talking about love, of course, presumably in 1970s, a heterosexual pairing, and one that would buy a gift of jewelry, gold, or precious metal, as a token of love to a love interest, or very serious love interest, if not a wife. Okay, so that's where I'd like to end today. What I would simply like to open it up then is for you to think about your own media images, to start amassing, pay attention to your world, and ultimately begin to come up with a media image on your own to analyze. That's the assignment. If any of this has helped structure your assignment, then please feel free to borrow from some of the questions or some of the ideas that we're working with. I would like to ask you, though, to always choose your own material, something that is new, something that is not presented in lecture. That's the important piece, so that you choose something of your own and that you present that, or you analyze it on your own terms in the manner that we've been doing so here. Okay, good luck with it, and thanks. Next time we'll be talking about a similar time period, more or less, but also television. Audiovisual. Thanks. See you next time.